This is Dave Monk, your Prairie Monk, WEFT Champaign, 90.1 on your FM dial. And we're going to continue with some discussion of art and the environment, and perhaps a specific site. I want to remind you that this is the 40th year of WEFT, and I think it is doing very well, and I would encourage you to support. There have been a few rude suggestions that there might be a television aspect to WEFT. We don't know whether that will ever happen, but it's a thought. A picture is worth 1,000 words. We recently went around Busey Woods with 60 cell phone pictures, and it would have taken a fortune of time to try and put those words into language, those pictures into language. So we'll try experimenting here. We're an experimental radio station. We've gone through all sorts of genres. Reggae, for instance, is not a usual program that is on other stations. There's talk programs. There's feed from the rest of the world that make WEFT a viable station, and one that you would enjoy to listen to. I was listening to Women Making Waves last week, and I thought it was a very good program, and said so to Cope, who was on that day. But all the consortium of the Women Making Waves do a wonderful job, and so do others. I can't name them all, but really it's fun to listen to. And so with that, I'm going to take you to Lake Park. The Lake Park has a little prairie. It's about 2.5 acres, not very big. And when you have that smaller site, you have to know that some species will take over, and you have to do something about it. You have to have management. So a small plot of prairie especially is not without management. Some people think you can throw out a few prairie seeds and it will exist on its own. If it's 10,000 acres, you can do that. You can do that and get, if a species takes over one corner, there'll be some of it at another corner. But when you get smaller and smaller, you're going to have to manage it. The sunflowers will take over. So you have to be careful what you're planting, and you might have to contain them sometimes, exterminate them sometimes, tell them how to behave themselves. So it's a fun experience. I've been talking a little bit about actually putting some art into your prairie. You can have a 10 by 10 plot, but you can also have an interesting 10 by 10 plot that has some character to it. You add a little bit of history there, or something different, a tree perhaps. So we work at that. So how did Lake Park become about? Well, Route 45 was a highway, but it was a 2-lane highway, and it was a major highway for Champaign-Urbana and other communities. It was in the 60s that expressways went in, so 57 took quite a bit of the load, but there's still a lot of traffic on Route 45. So it was widened to 3 lanes, 2 lanes and a suicide lane in the middle where you'd turn. And then later there was a further expansion into the land owned between the road and the railroad line. So we borrowed equipment and got some grant money and took some of that prairie off what is now the middle of the road and put it across onto what remained of the Department of Transportation and the railroad right of way. We couldn't always burn it because there's a fear that the railroad ties will catch on fire and the traffic on 45 would be vulnerable to smoke and perhaps even crash into each other if they can't see through it. It's a responsible job to burn adjacent to a highway, and the wind changes. So you do a little bit at a time and you make wind breaks, so you don't do a whole slug at once. Some of that material was taken by a grant to the village of Savoy to move it to a site just east of Winfield Village and north of Lake Park and near to Curtis Road and First Street. So how did we get there? Well, when development was there and Bowash and others were developing the prairie area, Lake Park was a large meander. And the intent was to cut off at the neck and let the water flow directly toward the Umbra. That neck would run a little faster and the remaining oxbow would become a lake. Well, the cutoff eroded and that was a problem. And Dick Burwash approached me and said, is there anything you can do with prairie to plant that 45-degree cutoff? It's too steep for most roadside vegetation, which has rather small roots. So, yes, I said, let's try prairie. And one of the questions was, how long will it take? Roadside restoration, brome grass and other plants can return to a green plush within a few weeks. Well, I said, give it 10 years, but these plants have roots and they will help you. And they have done that. So we hauled some of that remnant prairie from the railroad and the roadside to Lake Park and dumped it. Not always an easy event because the high hose that lifts the prairie sod turn it upside down. And when it is dumped by a tandem truck, the dumped material is upside down. And believe you me, if you have 10 inches of topsoil with prairie plants upside down, it takes talent to move it by hand. You almost have to have a front end loader or something like that to move it. We had the help of a front end loader from someone who rents that equipment, modern equipment, south uh, of Savoy, near to Tolono. And the comment was, we've been watching you guys for years, and we like what you do. I have a new front end loader that no one has rented yet. You can have it till it's rented. That was marvelous because it was a big machine and it could move the prairie and turn it over to some extent. Not all. Some of our helpers were more inclined to put the plants together, more or less like sodding a lawn. We don't have to do that. The plants will fill themselves in before. We also had a few problems that the remnant plants come with the weeds that have accumulated over the years. One of them is adjacent to the railroad line. It's called hemlock. And hemlock just seems to eat herbicide and enjoy it. And it can be a mess. It's kind of on the poisonous side. Is if you get the sap on your arms, you're likely to get dermatitis. And it's a nuisance. So some of the soil came with weeds. It came with sweet clover, which is often planted on roadsides to act as a living fertilizer. But we planted, first of all, we planted prairie seed on the cutoff, on the 45-degree angle, and waited for it. Then we rented 8 feet of extra space with the soil reasonably intact, as in a cornfield. Then Dick watched what we were doing and said we didn't have to rent anymore. And we took over 2.5 acres of his farmland, which was quite generous. And by this time, development had come in, and his 40-acre field, which was adjacent to Hurcurtis Road, got to be development of a Prairie Fields retirement center and a bunch of apartments. Winfield Village was already there. There was a lot of topsoil. So the landscape committee of the Lake Park got together with Glenda Lane, who had a house there. Glenda and Larry Lane had some farm background, as well as Larry was in charge of proceedings at the Covenant Hospital. So he had that background, and Glenda has some background in land and farming. So they did a negotiation for a berm, and that berm went up on the north side of the 2.5 acres. And gradually over 30 odd years, the prairie has grown. And Lake Park has provided a mower for the trails that we put through it. It first of all got to be 4 feet wide, and then it got to be 5 feet wide, which is a little disappointing for us, because when you start to mow the edges of a prairie, then invasive mowing plants come in, and you can see it today. I was walking there last night, and sure enough, the 5-foot mower is creating a little ridge of invasive plants or lawn type plants. But it will give people the chance to walk beside each other rather than behind each other. So we're very glad to have that mowing. We keep trees out of it because trees weren't a place for it. And most of the trees that come in are not cottonwoods, but what we call crud trees, trees that take advantage of the drainage and the soils and grow quickly. They're not the serious cottonwoods that have deep roots into aquifers and can handle drought and things like that. So we're trying to make this a natural prairie. It's in effect a garden. We're gardening with prairie. So let me pause a while and remind you where photography comes in, where art comes in. Some people are clever at drawing species, and some people are photographers, and they all have a language of their own, and it's a language that can be picked up by you. So there's a story to tell. So you need to be right there on 45 when it starts to be dug up, and you need to have a photograph of that hi-ho or front-end loader and see what they're doing and who is driving it and what volunteers are making sure that the sod gets onto the trucks. And you also have to know that this soil is soft and wet. It's on the backside of the piezoda moraine. And bless me, you can get your front end loader bogged. You can take a while to get it out of there. You're lucky to get out without having to go and get another instrument to pull it out. So I can go to that prairie on 45 and know where I got bogged with a front end loader. It's a learning process. Okay, so you need someone in the background who doesn't have to be working with a shovel or working with heavy equipment to take a record of that. So you have to have the talent to see the shovel, to see the point of the plant. Most people don't know the plant, so I had to, who was on my own ignorance, but fair bit of knowledge of prairie to point out that that was a compass plant or that was a whatever it was, and so the photographer needs to take a photograph of it. If the photographer is kind to you, he or she will make a picture where you can recognize the plant. Do you want a picture of a snake hidden in an ecosystem? Well, yes, you might. You want that. You might need that to say, this is what we need for a snake. But in kindness, you should be able to see that bee balm and imagine picking a leaf and smelling it. And so the photographer has to take a picture of someone smelling the roses, in this case, the bee balm. And there's a certain sort of excitement that is captured by a camera. And in the background, there might be an artist taking a cartoon copy of the exercise. So it will emphasize the railroad and the roadside and the land in between and the permission we have to put grasses down to the drainage ditch, and then we can replant mitigation prairie on the drainage ditches that's going to be organized. it's not always understood that we have those directives. So you have to have a book of plans to know where the manipulation is going to be, where will be the ditch, what are you going to lose, what do you take out, what do you want to leave because it's nature. And it's very obvious because here is right on a 45. And people have to wonder what you're doing there. It's a narrow piece, no more than 50 feet wide. Not something you can put a trail down easily because there's not much left if you put a trail through it. And the trail will grow over each year. And there are little pieces of poison ivy here and there. So a good artist might take that poison ivy and show 3 leaves and make a little statement on the side, let it be. And it has more or less reddish veins. They might be there. And so the artist is working, the photographer is working, the people who are moving the sod are in themselves artists. They're artist engineers. They know how to lift sod and put it in a tandem truck and move it. But we're working as a team, and the artist is part of that team. Some of this material went up the hill to the Barnhart's Prairie. They had a set aside on the hill on Yankee Ridge. And a set aside means that the government is prepared to pay you to not put land that is easily erodible into agriculture, but to put it into protective materials that would save the soil from going down into the Mississippi and creating a hypoxia zone or dead zone in the Gulf. So there's another artist. This is a farmer. And the farmer has to be convinced that prairie plants are not going to invade his corn and soybeans. And they just look like weeds, folks. But his son, Donald, had come to a field trip with a class when he was about 10 or 11. And he was now older and he could drive his father's tractor and the family tractor. And he could gather up some of the cordgrass that would be suitable for a drainage area on the lower part of the farm that was adjacent to the Ombra drainage basin. So Donald was in college as an engineer. He is now a doctorate in visual arts. He knows how to put together imagery so that you can have 3-dimensional objects. And there's a specialty in this. You see it some in little cards where you can move the card around and you can see the elephant moving in different directions. So Donald was an artist and father was an artist. Father created a harvest box that could harvest individual plots of big blue stem and Indian grass and little blue stem, mostly grasses, because they grow quickly and they're impressive and give some instant gratification. So father was very helpful in this, still experimental. But now go back to Lake Park, which is down on the west side of the Ombara River, and it's only a creek at that point, but it's still draining in that direction. And we too have taken some cordgrass, uh, and it grows well. And we get the help of a seed company that has facilities that can help us and can actually provide us with some joint grass seed. It's a little bit from the west, but it gives character to a portion of the prairie and lets people know the plants that are universal on prairies, whether they be more wet to the east or drier to the west. We don't specialize in that, but when the opportunity is arriving for something different, there's the person who is researching joint grass who is prepared to have his story, and so he is an artist too in his own way, working with the genetics of the grasses. So by this time we have a drainage basin that with a trail around it and about probably the best part of 50 plants growing, not a lot of them. There might be only 2 or 3 lead plants or certain plants here and there, but you can really get an idea of a prairie. And there are the people who come to town, and they have their own missions, but they are curious about the Midwest ecosystem. So if you have a docent person who knows about prairie, they can take that person in hand on the way from the airport or to the airport and take them on a 10-minute trip of a 2.5 acre prairie. So they become artists in their right too. And there's a little bit of protection here. It might be even from native creatures. We had a friendly beaver, and the friendly beaver could create a dam. It got to be so friendly and watched by people that it would do it not nocturnally, but during the day. It would chop down willow trees that grow in the drainage basin and put them into its dam. And that's the antithesis of what the farmer would want to have happen, because the whole purpose of doing this is to get water off the landscape so that agriculture can go ahead. And that agriculture is encouraged by a cow college or a first university, which again was a creative event. And creative events become regular events after a while, and you don't regard them as quite so creative, but they often sit between law and no law. And that lawyers do take regular laws and work with them in great detail and argue about them. And but there are always issues outside of the law. So we have lawyers who have creativity and control, but we also have people who look at the prairie and say, this is going fast. We're losing our ecosystem. So there's George Fell and his wife, Barbara. And George is a student of early ecologists, Wetzel and Forstall, and later Kendi, and they're doing their best to talk to people about the combination of plants. It's not just you preserving a bird or a creature or a plant. It's how the creature comes together in a habitat. Well, George and Barbara came from Rockford, and they were standing on an airport that wanted an expansion, and they were quite illegal to do that. But from a point of view of the advocacy of the plants, they were doing a right thing. And George and Barbara decided to go to Washington and create the Nature Conservancy. And the ecologists that were here were using prairie on the Big Four railroad that came through Urbana and Champaign, and only came through linearly and left right away on either side. And students would come and observe, but also research that ground. So there again, we have innovators and artists in their own right. We have a little competition with recreators that want to go from A to B, and you want to go in reasonable order. The terrain should be nice. So we have a Kickapoo Trail, which is wide, so wide that it takes out the original thought foundations of these early ecologists and continuing ecologists. So we lost some people there. We lost people who are obeying regular rules and what a road should be, and EPA and what the creosote might concern them, and the ADA, the American Disabilities Act, which would like wheelchairs to be able to use a wide trail. And bingo, there's a widening of the road. The area adjacent to the bed is near to a road, and it's a Highway 150, and it needs to be widened. Where does it get widened into? The railroad bed. It looks like it could do with that, and there bingo goes some of your original prairie that probably had a little bit to do with Nature Conservancy that is now around the world. So go back to our Lake Park plot, and let's look at these artists working together in their own way. Burning the Prairie. One lived in the Winfield Village, it was Marcella Ridgway. And when we were putting in the prairie and having problems with water, she gave hoses that would allow us to water the prairie. And then all manner of people on the first development on Winfield, on Lake Park Village, gave us hoses from their household water across it to the prairie. Again, cooperation and artistry and wonder. And there were other people who lent us carts, so we would have carts of water and the opportunity to water plants that are used to being watered and have had their feet cut off, their roots cut off, and have to grow. But now the prairie is 30 years old, and or even more than that, and I'm watching the latest burn, and I am photographing plants. It's very hard to recognize some prairie plants coming out of the the woodwork in early spring, but it's always fun to find them. And one of the things I was amazed to find, there were crawdad hills that in profusion and ants nests. And so once you build a prairie, some of the creatures will survive. There are ground squirrels. There are insects, and there are insects eating plants that wouldn't otherwise be there. And there are birds, there are red-winged blackbirds that scold you all the time because they have a nest there, and you can triangulate. You can hear them over there, and you can hear them over there, and you can hear them over there. So you can realize where the nest is, and you don't disturb it, but you might just see what's going on. And then the drainage ditch starts to grow willows. Willows like a lot of water, and that's again something that the farmers don't like. They want their water off quickly, and willows allow it to sink in. So the water conservation people love willows because they do allow water to sink into the underground aquifers. So there's a compromise here of working with willows and without willows, and you have to decide whether you want to cut them and herbicide the stump, or whether you want to just cut them and discourage them and not let a lot of herbicide down the stream. Again, you have to have an invasive plant specialist to dream ways of controlling that plant. And then just a little further, there is reed canary grass. And it's one of the hardest invasives to get rid of. And you want to control it, so you have to have volunteers to cut the seed heads off, because you don't want 450 million seed heads sprinkling their ugly seeds into the soil for the next century. Again, that's an artistic thing to do. Even to working with the mowing people. If a compost plant grows up in the middle of the trail, please don't cut it off, but go around it, make this trail a little wiggly woggly rather than rectilinearly straight. And don't mow it twice, just mow it once. It's enough for that circumstance. But this is very different from the mowing that we do. So talking to the mowing people and having them to realize and even get excited about what is there. There are some people who would just as soon have that 2.5 acres in a mowing lawn with a few popsicle trees here and there, and that would be much more nice and tidy. Then there are people who can do sculpture. So at the moment, there's a sculptured gentleman in the middle of the prairie and with a hat and has character, and this is part of the prairie. And so last night I was there, and I was absolutely amazed at the number of people who were walking partially in family style, partially as individuals, partially as couples, all at the evening time, walking on the boom. I'm sure some of them didn't understand a word about what they were walking through, but they needed the exercise, and this was a trail. Some were taking a stick and whacking at the prairie, and I controlled myself and didn't say, "Excuse me, but you shouldn't do that. that little plant is trying to grow. And, but I see this family of mainly Mexicans here walking on the trail along with individuals from Lake Park, which is nearby to Winfield Village, but it's fairly affluent subdivision compared with Winfield Village, which is a public housing settlement and it's not so affluent. So sometimes Winfield Village gives us some support money because it's a field that's used by Winfield Village. And there is Canadian thistle, Canada thistle. And it can be invasive. It can take over your prairie and you don't have any prairie anymore. And now there's people in Lake Park who have been treating the Canadian thistle with herbicide and taking away the seed heads. And that will give the prairie a chance to grow. And as I walk, I look at characters. There's mustard weed out at the moment. It's in the line. I can't for the life of me think why it's in a line. Is it because it gets more sunlight from the south? Is it because the berm was put up in a certain row and a certain soil was there? I still don't know, but that's what you need to do is to look and see and ask yourself questions about what is there. Are the pussycatoes up yet? They come early in the season. Is the hyacinth growing yet? Sometimes the hyacinth gets picked because it's interesting. And so the park has put up signs. So you need a sign person to make it a $200 sign that encourages people to think about what they're walking through and stay on the path. I didn't stay on the path. I was out there looking for plants. And 2 weeks apart, they grow. It's absolutely fantastic how fast they grow. So the monarda that was hardly showing is now a clump of monarda, and you can pick a leaf and smell it. And you can stand off into the prairie and let people go past. And you almost want to say, do you know what you're looking at or what you're passing? This is a little piece of our prairie that's down to 0.01% of the remnant prairie that is 10,000 years old. It's a sort of garden site where we manipulate and work with it, but you try to make it as natural as possible. And I wish I could show you this plant and tell you to watch this plant. It might be a prairie clover or culver's root. And you know, I can hardly recognize culver's root leaves at this time. It comes up in a candelabra type inflorescence. It's rather wonderful to see when it's there. But at this stage, you can't really say this is culver's root. I can. I know it, recognize it now. But just walking through, and there is Dick Wash's house. Dick has passed on now, and so has his wife. And there's the ditch, and there's all the little blue stem plants that have been burned. And they have all sorts of little shoots shooting up top. They're saying, thank you for burning the litter of last season or last several seasons off the top of me. And I'm going to grow. And my roots are down there 3 feet, 5 feet, 10 feet. And there might be a mile of rootlets on my bottom. And here we are. And the erosion is not occurring on that berm. It's not a berm, it's a ditch cut through the gooseneck of the meander. And every so often there is a groin. And Mark Sender was a soil specialist and worked with farmers. And he worked with Glenda Lane to put in 6 groins just because if you have a meander that's a long run, it takes a while to get around the meander of that water. But if it goes fast, quick through a gooseneck, it's got to go fast. So the answer is to put in a bunch of rocks and create a little pool that stops the flow of the water fast and allows a little waterfall. And at this time of the year, you could actually see the groins and see the ponding behind and hear the waterfall. It may only be 6 or 10 inches, but you can hear it. And so there's a sound on the prairie. The sound is often very human. It's a train a mile away, or it's cars on the highway. But as the prairie grows to 6 and 8 and 10 feet tall, you can put a child in the prairie and they cannot hear those sounds. So this is an interesting place for people who haven't experienced a prairie before. There was a little treatment plant there, and you always have to watch adjunct space. It belonged to the village of Savoy. It was miles too small for the development that had occurred around it. So it was obsolete, but we got to have a tractor in there. We got to have storage of plants. We tried selling plants from there, but the sludge ponds were a little wet, and we had to have a regular supervision. If you're going to grow plants, you're going to have to water them every day. You need to have people on top of them. You have to be transplanting them when they get too numerous in a seed bed, and you want to pot them out for a sale like the Grand Prairie Friends is going to have on May 2nd, is where you have Zoom call-ins for the sale of plants. And they do so well because people are beginning to realize that this is their heritage, and it's almost extinct. Even if they're going to plant free forest plants this Saturday, they're going to have to plant them on prairie soil because there were only a few forests, and they were on drainage ditches and sometimes on well-drained moraines, but they were big groves and dense. And most of you who will be picking up trees will be taking them home to what used to be prairie soils, and you will be planting them on prairie soils. And I want you to realize as you are planting that forests were not the ecosystem of this region. 94% of the 2/3 prairie of this prairie state were prairies. So not so easy to hug, not so easy to sit under with shade, but alive with genetic biochemicals we don't know whether we will want or not in 25 years' time, when that's if we're still around. But this is another artistic territory where you have people who have skills in RNA and DNA, and they can breed. And do we really want to disturb that native growing plant, which may be contributing in the future a gene to the augmentation of a prairie plant? It might be a food plant that we want to have drought and flood resistance, and also grow and expand in a tough territory. And therein lies another artist, perhaps thinking of doing things in a laboratory, but watching what goes outside. And once again, the herbicide person, and sometimes very experimental. Dicamba is an herbicide which is really very dangerous, and so uh, it it spreads around. So there you have a farmer that is award-winning farmer uh, in the News Gazette for this region, who has worked with the agricultural people doing experimental work, trying to figure out what to do with some of our monocultures and make them more biodiverse, and how to work with equipment that's gone from horses to humongous tractors, how to put in a little fertilizer on sandy soil, which doesn't retain the fertilizer, and a lot more fertilizer where there are drummer and Flanagan soils that are deep and rich and black and full of organic matter and can contain the fertilizer. We need that computer in there, and we need the tractor that doesn't sink into the soil. We need dual wheels, and there again is John Deere and the early production of a moldboard plow that covered up the prairie weeds and or the prairie plants, and so that you could grow corn or you could grow hay for cattle. And once again, you have a whole family that is making agriculture possible. And we go into the future with those sorts of debates. Debates about rainfall and how it falls and where there are tornadoes, and they bring in artists to take the numbers and plant colors on the individual spots where baby tornadoes might occur. And so once again, there's an artist involved with another artist and looking at the landscape. And we want you to do the same. It's your responsibility to walk through your landscape and think about it. We had a little prairie across the road, and it's now a beer garden, and we've moved it to the Second Street ditch. And tonight we'll have some planting of a wetland species in a situation which is very wet. The whole point of it is there's a 5-year rainfall, a 5-inch rainfall, and the pond, which is probably about 20 feet deep, will collect water, and it won't run out so fast that it floods Green Street and you can row downstream Green Street. So we have plant specialists, Julian George and Culdeeper and others, just a few of us. But if you would like to come along, you can help us plant plants that will grow in waterlogged situations. And you'll see some of our prairie plants growing. They don't have the forest and some of the shade opportunities that some of our plants had, so they've died. But the other plants are doing well, and they give a boost to the trails around the two ponds that have been planted to prairie. And there, once again, the city people and Heath and others who are responsible for that have burned the prairie. And just a frightening thing to do when you have houses around. And so you have to know what you're doing. But the plants are saying thank you. They may have some of their last year's litter left spread around them, like 9 pins or skittles. And the heat and light is getting into the plant. And there it is growing amongst its charcoal green shoots and saying, thank you for doing what you did. And yet, at the same time, there are some people who have asthma that can't stand that smoke. So a prairie fire is usually fairly uh, scudsy, and it doesn't create a lot of smoke. But if you have a serious burn in a forest in the west, it creates a lot of charcoal, and it flies in the air. Uh, my people lived in a mountain situation where uh, some of that material could rise up on heat thermals and go 3 miles away and drop on a house, and the owners would be amazed at how did they become part of the fire when it's miles away. Well, that's part of nature, folks. Uh, and then you have a storm of burning that is deleterious to health. But if you carefully burn over the years and stop the accumulation of litter, you can have a safe prairie. And that's what we have in Lake Park. And we say thank you to Dick Bowash, who was one of the developers, and Lake Park participants, and there's 70 of them, and we have to send them information. So we have a CD on Lake Park, and it's private territory, but you're allowed to go walk there. Just treat it well. Don't leave plastic in there. But if there's a plastic that came in with the wind, pick it up and take it away and put it in the right place. There's a hope that the 45 prairie will maintain its original prairie. At the moment, there are railroad ties all along there, and the railroads are improving their railroad steel. So they're removing old ties and replacing them with new. The old ties lasted a long time because they were cut with an adze and a broadaxe, and they followed the line of the grain of the tree, and therefore they were less prone to erosion. These days, the ties are sawn straight, so they have a more vulnerability to wear and tear with. So creosote is added, and that has some questions associated with it. But for people who are just looking at the prairie, the railroad ties are going to take a few months to put in and restore, and you have to lift up that railroad line and take out the old tie and put it in. There again is an artistry of people who work with railroad lines, and sometimes they sing. They want to move a piece of railroad at an eighth of an inch, then they will have a certain song, and at the certain moment they will put the railroad in. They will have tongues, and they can lift this heavy line and put it into place. These days we do it with equipment, and it's much safer to work with that, but it's too, these people are artists in their own right, and they have a twinkle in their eye when something works. And that railroad line, as it goes around a bend, will have to be a little higher on one side and a little lower on the other. And you can't have it too low, or the railroad car will fall over. So you have to know what you're doing too. And but in there, we have to be generalists, some to be able to combine all these special interests and knowledges, so that the rough and tough generalists can understand enough to be able to bring the groups together. And I think that's probably enough about the Lake Park Prairie. Think about visiting it sometime and respecting it, and looking east to the Yankee Ridge Moraine and the Ombra River, and Uh, the water that runs down from now heavily developed areas and into the Ombra more than it used to do in the future past. It used to sink into the aquifer because there was vegetation there. There was prairie vegetation and with deep roots. So think about these things as you're going down the road. It's time. This is Dave Monk, your Prairie Monk, WEFT Champaign, 90.1 on your FM dial. And think about going to the Grand Prairie Friends Prairie Sale and buying yourself a piece of heritage. Bye.